Now we're refacing the block. Will give us a perfectly flat finish. We're using a polycrystallised diamond as a tool to finish it, which is the latest surface technology. We're taking 5 thou for block, Peter. That should give us a good clean surface for the gasket to sit on.
This is quite an amazing machine. What we're doing now?
Well, we're grinding the crankshaft now. We're spinning the crankshaft up and checking the dynamic balance of the crank, where it's out of balance and where to correct it. Just fit the bearings. It's just trying the camshaft in before you take it.
Tell you what, it's very heavy, this. But isn't Pete, mate, a good old sort, eh? He sent all this back for me so I can start building whilst he continues with the cylinder head with Paul at the workshop. Now, one thing I need to show you here before I start taking this apart is the fact that Paul has very sensibly put on all these lining up marks to make sure that when I strip it and then put it back together again, I put it together in exactly the same positions in terms of flywheel to crank particularly and also clutch, so that it's still balanced the way it was balanced on the balancing machine. First job will be to strip that and then whack that into the refurbished block. But before we do that, I just want to share with you my experiences in the film industry. In the film The Fly, you probably watched it, they spent a huge amount of money on special effects. Now, they didn't need to, OK, because they only had to ring me here and we could have helped them out. Excuse me. Bzzz. Convincing, eh? Always have to ruin it. Next job is to put in half of each of the main bearing shells, 5 main bearings in this engine. They just slot in. We're putting those in dry and just pressing them in place and then put loads of oil on top of them before we put the crank in. Then loads of oil, because it really is important, obviously, to make sure that everything is well lubricated. A lot of engine failures can be traced back to problems very early on in their running. So you just want loads and loads of lubrication. And then finally, the crank can just drop in very carefully, like so. The only bits we haven't put in here are the thrust bearings that are in the middle on the centre main bearing, that, if you like, take up the end float of the crank. And when that's in there like that, you can see, actually, now it will rotate, there we go, you can see where these holes are in the webs of the crank, which is where the metal's been taken out to balance it. Now, the crank itself probably would have been balanced originally in the factory, but it's a good idea if you're rebuilding an engine to get your crank balanced with everything attached to it that you can, because it'll be a much better job when it's finished. Right, that's done. Now the main bearing caps already put their half shells in. In the casting, it says here front. This is the front of the engine away from me here, so this has got to face that way. But also, we've then put in the number of the bearing. So on this one, you can see these 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it drops in there. So if you just push it on, well lubricated again, these are pretty easy to get in, so you can do it with your fingers. So push down, you can feel it go. Right, we can torque these up and we can move on. You're probably wondering, by the way, what's happened to the body shell? It's moved on to the body shop for the first of its 2-part paint process, and it will be back next programme, OK? That is if they don't damage it en route, because it's going on the trailer and I'm driving it and it could all go tits up. The worst 2 bearing caps to put in are at the front and the back. I'm going to do the back one first. Just gently tap it down. So I'm just torquing up to 95 Newton meters. We've hit a bit of a problem, and it's a serious problem. We've put everything in, torqued up all the main bearing caps, but the crank should rotate really freely now in its bearings. But actually, when you turn it, it's really notchy. And you hit kind of spots like that where it's difficult to get over them, and then it'll flick round and it's stopped again there. It's not right. You should be able to rotate the crank by hand. something is pinching it up. Now, we've had it in and out 3 times, Les and I, and we really can't find out what the problem is. There's certainly nothing obvious. What we have spotted is on the bearing shells, you can see these little witness marks. They're in the same place on each of the shells, as if that might be pinching slightly there. But also, you can see if I put this ruler across the top of the shell there, there's a gap between the ruler and the bearing cap itself, because the shell is actually slightly bigger than the cap. What I've done is ring Paul at the Engine Works, but we haven't got time to take it over there because we've got too much to do here. So possibly for the first time in the history of engineering, part of an engine is going in its very own taxi.
Taxi!
Oh no, it's not going to fit!
Bigger taxi!
Bigger taxi, Pete! Well, it's back, and there was a problem. So it's a good job we didn't send it back for a bit of refurbishing. Basically, it was due to one of these 2 middle main bearings, and I'll show you on a little picture what I mean by that. If that's the bearing cap there, and this bit's the block, so you're looking at it as a cross-section, this is the hole, the bore through the bearing cap, and this dimension here, the diameter of that circle, was 1.5 thou too small. Now, to give you an idea of what 1.5 thou is, this is a feeler gauge set, and that feeler gauge is 1.5 thou. Not much, is it? But enough that could have potentially really damaged that engine. So it's resolved now, we're sorted, so the next thing we can do is put the pistons in. This is one of the 4 new pistons, and you can see on here that it is bored out to 60 thou, the bore, so the piston will now fit. So all I've got to do with these is put on the piston rings. The first of those is the oil scraper. Then there are 2 other parts to this oil scraper ring. It's the top of the 3 parts. These are the other 2 rings. The inside bevel must go up towards the top of the piston. And then these are quite brittle, so you don't want to spread it too much. Les is going to guide it in onto the crank. Going. There we go. Always a good idea.